Everyone, welcome. I hope you have more or less recovered or found yourself back in working life after what was the spring bank holiday weekend, the Memorial Day weekend. It's a hangover, I'm told, from Whitsun Monday. Whit Monday is the reason we all got yesterday off. And there's been too much talk about the coronavirus in the UK and not enough about the weather. It's been an amazingly sunny few days that we would otherwise have been talking about if it hadn't been for all this. Today, at lunchtime, as you know, Tuesdays is the time that we host our open news meeting where we try to hear from as many people as possible about the stories that people think are being missed, either not reported at all or underreported or an angle that's gone unseen. We're going to follow up with Chris Cook, who's had, as you may see, an extremely handsome haircut, and talking about his file this week, which is on universities and the crisis that is quietly and soon not so quietly engulfing the university sector. Our editor, Basha Cummings, has been putting together our open news list for the week, so is trying to get us to think about some of the stories that we're either working on or think we might need to look at. In particular, we are beginning to think about how do we look at Amazon. How is it discharging its responsibilities? What is the data that it's collecting? We're thinking a little bit about how we deal with the art sector, culture business, the restoration of culture. As you'll have seen, there's more and more anxiety about this. It's very clear what practically is being done. And everyone, I'm sure, is going to have their own view on what Dominic Cummings, the Prime Minister's chief advisor, should or shouldn't do next. We're going to come to all of those things, but last week I dropped a note to the New York Times' relatively new media editor, because if you're a follower of these things, Ben Smith had written probably the most talked about piece in global journalism last week, which was, hello Ben, very nice to see you. Very nice of you to do this. I imagine you're relatively bleary-eyed in New York, so thank you for getting up and joining us. How are you?
Sorry, I'm trying to unmute.
No, you're here. We hear you loud and clear. You're unmuted. Oh, now you've muted yourself.
Oh, okay. Still not having mastered Zoom. I'm well. I'm I think like sweaty rather than bleary-eyed. But
okay.
Other than that,
thank you for that. That's great. You know,
yeah, thought you should know that.
The sense of smell that Zoom doesn't quite deliver for us, but nice to know that. So I'm not going to précis at too much length what Ben wrote, because I'm going to ask you, Ben, if you like to do that and tell us a little bit about the writing of it. But the reason that I was really keen and thought that it's a kind of critical subject for a newsroom like ours to discuss is that in Ben's piece last week, he reviewed the journalism of Ronan Farrow, the New Yorker reporter, previously NBC, who had, as many people know, played a really pivotal role in the reporting on the Harvey Weinstein scandal. To be fair, of course, it was also two reporters of the New York Times who had been the driving force behind the exposure of that scandal. But what Ben identified was a phrase that I'd not heard before and I thought was incredibly important, which was the idea of resistance journalism. What happens when a reporter is essentially taking on a particular person in power or an aspect of the establishment? And of course, a great deal of that really appeals to us. But the question has always been whether or not when we take the side of our sources, we lose context and the willingness to challenge them. And in the current circumstances, journalism, I think, is really debating this issue. We are really drawn, and I say this personally, by the idea of constructive journalism, a journalism that is willingness to try and find solutions as well as identify problems. We're all romantically, massively drawn to a journalism that takes on the powerful and gives voice to the voiceless. And I suppose what Ben did was to try and raise for us some of the risks as well as the rewards of resistance journalism. And so, Ben, if we can, I'd like to just sort of hand over to you to begin with, just to talk a little bit about the writing of that story and also the nature of the idea of resistance journalism, what you think it means.
Thanks. Well, thank you for having me. I feel like I'm not a charter Tortoise subscriber, but I've been subscribing for a while, so it's fun to be on here. And I think I don't want to like totally sign off on James's paraphrase of everything I think. I will put that to the side. Just James speaks for himself. But I guess, my own, I was running BuzzFeed for 8 years before I was at just got to the Times. And I think, we were kind of very rooted in social media, and you obviously feel this strong pull to, and I would say it's not the pull to side with your sources, which is one real journalistic thing, or to take shots at the powerful, which is the point in some ways. It's that there's this other source of power, which is these social media narratives, and it's sort of the impulse to side with those and to feed those and kind of stream on them. And I think that, and I certainly don't think Ronan Farrow is the only person who's ever done this. But I guess I kind of noticed it in his work in a kind of obscure story in October, I guess the summer of 2018. It was written as a story about this heroic whistleblower in the Department of Treasury who had revealed sort of hitherto secret files because he was afraid that he had sort of in the course of his ordinary civil servant job realized that there was a cover-up underfoot. It was really written like a movie, and it almost immediately totally collapsed. The guy had essentially been searching for a document, hit a screen that said, "This is restricted, call the librarian," more or less. It did not say this document is mysteriously missing, but he had been searching for it because Michael Avenatti, this sort of scumbag lawyer, later sent to prison, had tweeted, "I'd like some of these secret documents." And the guy's lawyer basically said he was a victim of watching too much cable news.
Right.
He leaks these documents to Avenatti. He then kind of essentially gives what the prosecutors believe is his alibi to Ronan Farrow, who writes it as this cinematic drama. And I think the thing that got me about the story was that even in the "to be sure" paragraph, some people say that maybe this is an innocuous mistake by a moron, which it turned out to be. Even then, it would be totally shocking that this guy couldn't find these documents. It's still even the lack of conspiracy is a conspiracy. And just none of that was true. The story totally collapsed. Everybody moved on, of course, except for me and Jason Leopold, this great reporter there I worked with at the time, who remained kind of a little obsessed with it. And it just sort of made me look at kind of how Ronan had done some of his reporting on the biggest stories. And I think what I found certainly wasn't that Harvey Weinstein is actually turns out to be a great guy, right? I mean, an enormous amount of reporting really revealed him to be a monster. But it was that in the course of just that the way Ronan did his reporting was to bolster these narratives rather than to insert questions, even when there were questions. When he had been one of Weinstein's victims or alleged victims who, and I would say, and this is a case where Weinstein's defense was that it was sexual harassment, that he was offering sex for a job, itself obviously against the law, and essentially, that Farrow wrote her story in a way that kind of masks that he hadn't been able to corroborate it. And then when the police came to her and when her story started to get more complicated, in the way these stories often do, where witnesses didn't remember exactly the same stuff, the cops literally say, or not literally, but effectively say to the witness, "Hey, just stick to the New Yorker story. Stop making this so complicated." And then they get caught doing that, and then part of the case falls apart.
I mean, I should just say one thing, which is we don't have Ronan Farrow here and we don't have David Remnick here to sort of give their side of it. And obviously they did we stand by our journalism. Will you just talk, though, the reason why I think there's an element of this that does fit that, do you side with your sources, do you interrogate them forcefully enough, is around the Matt Lauer case. And no one's, I suppose, questioning the overall case, but some of the elements of that. Do you want to talk through that?
Sure, and this is actually in some ways kind of a simple one, because Lauer was fired for, essentially using his power in the workplace to have sex with junior colleagues. I mean, something that's just totally, there's no defense of that, I don't really think. He was also accused later of rape. And again, in that case, when you cover these Me Too stories, and we published a number of BuzzFeed, it's really important to call the friends that the victim spoke to at the time, because it can really bolster the sense that this is something that they remembered clearly in the moment. And there was a scene in the story where she tells a friend immediately after an incident. And, Farrow just never called the friend who would have said, "Actually, I don't remember it this way," which doesn't invalidate it, but it's the sort of thing you'd want to know. And you wouldn't want to come out in the it felt, it's making a case rather than sort of being transparent about what you know and what you don't. I don't think it's interesting because, I began with this Fry's story as a example because I think this stuff comes up all over the place, including in a lot of Farrow's coverage, but it's really like Donald Trump is at the center of it. And I think it's at least here this sense that that reporters get away with more and are sloppier when they're covering Trump because he does so many appalling things, which he does, that, one more here or there isn't going to tip the balance. I mean, I think in Britain, I'm sort of obsessed, but totally ignorant about your current Dominic Cummings mess. But the way that Cambridge Analytica was covered reminds me a little bit of this. Like those guys were obviously misused. The way in which Facebook was sharing data with them, is really is genuinely shocking. There was an implication that they tipped the election or had an impact in the election that I think was never proven.
Yeah.
And just sort of floated in the air around those stories. And there was, and it was this incredibly powerful narrative, the idea that the election was sort of fundamentally hacked. And I think, in some ways it was. WikiLeaks was the most obvious instance. But I think that narrative, I think the Trump isn't just doing shady business with people close to the Russian government. He isn't just asking in public for Hillary Clinton's emails, but he is in fact a Russian agent, is another instance of that.
But Ben, what interests me is that resistance journalism sounds quite appealing. Do you think there's inevitably a sloppiness or a laziness that might come with it?
I mean, I guess I meant it, I didn't intend to mean it. I should have given it a different name, I suppose. I didn't really want it to sound appealing. Because I was sort of trying to imply the sloppiness and the laziness. There's a lot of very strong coverage of bad things that Donald Trump does that is, really very good journalism. I think to me, it's more that you can get away with more when you're sort of playing to the sort of dominant media narrative.
And what do you say to people who think, actually, we're living at a time, we had your New York Times colleague, Tom Friedman, on last week, and he was making the argument that you had, and he's a columnist like you, and as you know, has strong feelings about Donald Trump, and was saying, look, you've got a president there, backed by a Republican Party that has no spine and a Fox News network that has no integrity. And as a result of those things, by implication, I thought you need a journalism that is willing to stand up and to take a stand. What do you say to those people who think that, look, if journalism is just, if you like, blandly reporting, even accurately reporting everything that's said, it fails to see the deeper or more important issues and arguments at stake?
Well, I think I believe that. I just think that I think that doesn't necessarily conflict with the notion that you have to be humble about what you actually know and transparent about what you know. I see Ellie Jacobs in the comment there is talking about whether speed is a part of this. Yeah. And we're all doing this very fast in real time, which to me means obviously there will be more errors. And there have always been errors in journalism. We used to just be better at concealing them. And so and to me, you can either, work even harder to conceal your occasional errors, or you can try to be transparent about the practice. And it's a moment when Trump and his allies, lie so flagrantly, and it's sort of as a dare to call them on the lies. And I think in some ways there's an impulse to kind of fight fire with fire that among other things, don't think has been effective in any cases.
Well, I'm gonna just to scratch your itch on the Dominic Cummings story. I'm going to ask my colleague Chris Cook to weigh in, because Chris has spent some time with the lobby pass trying to make sense of how you do or don't ask questions. One of the issues here, Ben, was that Dominic Cummings gave a sort of rather extraordinary press conference in his garden yesterday afternoon, or in a garden, I should say, yesterday afternoon, and it's not clear whether or not he came off worse than the media. There's been a lot of reporting about the media this morning and about how it does or doesn't ask questions. Chris, what did you make of the questions that were asked and how they should be asked?
So I should say the exciting fridge behind me, is a cast off from BuzzFeed's offices in London. So I should thank for my...
It's familiar. It's a nice fridge.
with EU stars posted on it.
There was an early internet. I don't know if anyone remembers this, but at the very beginning of those sort of live streaming platforms, Meerkat and coming online, the thing to do was to show people the inside of your fridge. You would turn on and people would immediately say, "Can we see what's in your fridge?" So Chris, if this gets dull, we also want to know what's inside.
So I think the big thing to remember about TV reporters is that they're interested in answers that work on TV. And those are often not forensic, detailed answers, which are generally not best answered in a press conference anyway. They're generally more emotive. They're more likely to be sort of "how dare you" than a sort of finicky, difficult thing. There's also there's a thing about TV reporters as well, which is that TV reporters talk a lot about grammar, which is the idea that I used to be a TV reporter. The idea that there are things that you understand when you're watching TV that you don't realize you understand, right? So if you see someone who is on the left of the screen talking to the right, and then they cut to someone who's on the right of the screen talking to the left, then you understand they're talking to each other, right? You have that geared into your brain, even though no one's ever told you that's what it's supposed to represent. Similarly, if you show a press conference, it's really important to show yourself asking a question. It becomes easier to follow if it's sort of you're following through. And so one of the reasons why they all ask the same question is because they're all thinking in terms of their own packages. How am I going to use this in sort of 2 hours time? So part of the problem with what happened yesterday was all of those forces sort of collide, and you end up with this weird world where the TV reporters will all basically stand up and say, why did you ask the wrong question? Why are you so outrageous, Mr. Cummings? Rather than what, might be more useful in the longer term, which is sort of diligent questions about, you said on this day you did this. Just to be clear, you said you went home, your wife was symptomatic, and then you came back to work. That's a breach of the rules. You then went to Durham. That's a breach of the rules. You then went to Barnard's Castle. That's a breach of the rules, which I think is how we'd like to think we do it. It also doesn't help that they're political reporters who are not used to dealing with this kind of story. They're not, used to dealing with having to do this stuff. It's all quite sort of black and white. They all deal with it as a crowd. They're not individually trying to sort of break new ground.
So, Chris, what would you have asked if the microphone had gone to you? What would have been your question?
It would have been, so you went home. Your wife was symptomatic, then you went back to the office. Why is that not a breach? You decided that your wife was symptomatic, then you drove her to Durham. She ended up in hospital. The whole point of these rules is to stop people from spreading the virus. Her going to the hospital was, trying to stop her going to that hospital was part of the reason for locking us all down and stopping us traveling. How is that not a breach? And then obviously you did an eye test by driving 30 miles to Barnard's Castle, which is obviously absurd. But that's also a breach. There's there's absolutely no question of that. There are also other questions like, was there anyone in the car? Was it just you? We don't know anything about this detail. Did you stop anywhere else? Did you go on anywhere else? We know you didn't stop for petrol, you say. Did you, the Wakefields have a house in the northeast as well,
So all right, well, I will, I want to bring some of the other people who are sort of making some points about the style of journalism, and actually, I realised, I think I said his garden, of course I meant the Downing Street garden, forgive me for that. So I might as well try and get accurate in my own newsroom or digital newsroom. But just on the point about sort of the way questions are asked and TV questions in journalism, Ben, what do you think, what's the deal with that do you think that's happening in terms of, the White House press conferences? How much is that, do you think, become a feature of a sort of failure to ask the question interrogates the president rather than opposes the president?
I mean, I do think dealing with Trump is a different thing. And it's more that, do you ask him a question when you have a pretty good sense the answer will be ridiculous and confrontational, or do you try to direct it to one of these health officials standing near him, in the hopes that you'll get something that's interesting but less theatrical? And, he's basically, and I think a lot of leaders of his style do this, sort of uses those press conferences as a theater where it's him up on this big stage and these reporters sitting in little chairs, and it's sort of a theater of his power, and it kind of, and he he gets to be president every time they do it. And when, in some sense, and sort of Donald Trump battling the media is a show that he puts on every day. And so it's maybe entertaining, it may be good for certain reporters. And in some sense, it's hard to see your job there as not to confront him. And yet the net of it does seem to be that it's a show that he likes putting on and feels, and that seems to be kind of politically useful to him. So I think it's actually a somewhat different situation in the US. I did actually, if you don't mind, wanted to respond to another thread in the chat here, which is just that I actually think that sort of campaigning, I think that campaigning journalism, or I guess journalism of engagement, somebody said here, isn't really what I'm talking about. I think that you can do that in a way that is very rigorous, very transparent, very tough, and fair, and not leave yourself open to your story collapsing because you didn't call people, because you didn't do work. And I think I think that you see, I mean, I think actually The Intercept in the US, which is sort of our Breitbart of the left, does very aggressive campaigning journalism, but in a way that's very native to the internet and doesn't assert things they don't know to be true, doesn't project confidence they lack.
I suppose the reason why I think there is something that is that not undermines but certainly challenges the journalism when you do take a point of resistance, when you do, for example, try to be part of the answer. And it's live for us, you know, we launched Tortoise with an agenda that definitely looks to do some of that, is the risk that you run, that you're invested in the outcome. And that is, you know, in any campaigning journalism, that's clearly a risk. But you know, I think that's a risk. I'm going to bring, if I can, Ben, my fellow. So I think you know Polly Curtis. Polly, I want you to try and do a mix, if you can, of thinking a bit about this broader point about resistance journalism, solutions journalism, but then let's open things up on the Dominic Cummings question. Are you there and happy to weigh in? Hello there.
Yeah. So on both of those things, I was just thinking about how we're watching.
Is that a real place or a backdrop?
I was just thinking about how our norms of journalism are changing before our eyes, and our norms of accountability in the UK are changing before our eyes. And I think Ben's piece in the New York Times was a really important intervention to say, look, we need some basic rigorous standards of journalism. And I think there is a generational shift happening around resistance journalism. People want to get behind emotive campaigning issues, and I think that can't be at the expense of the truth. I also think there's a bit of grey area in all journalism, and we buy into a lie that things are black and white and always really, really clear cut. And I think it's the grey areas that are interesting and the grey areas that are true. And then just to reflect on the Cummings thing, you know, we're talking about the kind of media's handling of it. It just feels like dead cat after dead cat after dead cat. We're talking about Cummings when we should be talking about all those missed opportunities in February to stop the spread of the virus here. But we're also seeing the erosion of the accountability and a complete move to a White House style Trump disregard for the truth that has my blood boiling at the moment. And you know, everybody I've seen over the weekend just goes, I'm so angry. And we need to find something to do with that anger that isn't about turning the media on each other, about our handling on it.
Okay, I want to start hearing some more voices. So will you just, I probably should have told you, because I know you're all such now experienced Zoom operators that you know how to raise your hand. But if you don't, do just click on the participants tab. You'll see there's a little grey box that says raise hand, and then I'll come to you. So do raise that little blue digital hand, because I'd really love to hear from you. Actually, hold on a second. There are already some people who've got their hands up. Okay, Jonathan Hayward, I'm going to come to you if I might, because you've got a point about what this is all about. And then I'm going to come to my fellow editor, Matt Dancona, in a moment. Jonathan, hello there. So you were setting out a sort of 3-point plan to talk us through it? Hold on, are you free to speak? Have you been liberated to speak? This is like the Downing Street press conference. As soon as we want to hear from you, we mute you.
Now I've been liberated. Thank you, James. Yeah, I suppose I just try to very briefly set out a kind of taxonomy. We can get into a massive ethical quagmire here, and we can also get mixed up between ethics and the actual quality of journalism in terms of how well do you tell your story. So I suppose very briefly, I would say that I think we all have to accept that journalists are free to select and frame their stories. Even in a perfect world, even a broadcaster like the BBC, you still have to make choices about which stories you cover, why you think they're important, and how you frame those stories. It seems perfectly legitimate for large swathes of the media to have picked on the Cummings story as an important story and to frame it as a story about double standards. Then you've got the second issue, which is a kind of borderline ethics / engagement issue, which is like, I keep making the point, you know, in the legal system, lawyers build cases. Lawyers can pick their cases. They can be campaigning lawyers on particular human rights issues or employment law issues. They can consistently pick cases throughout their career. In the States, you see this even more, particularly in Me Too. There's some lawyers who really building careers on picking Me Too stories. They still have to play by the rules in terms of how they build their case. They can't make claims that are unjustified. And I do think a lot of our journalists need to think more carefully. I take Chris's point about forensic questions aren't always the ones that play best on rolling news, but you actually just don't build a very good case unless you're really clear what is the core allegation, what's the evidence that substantiates that allegation. And then the third issue really just is like making it good journalism, making it human, compelling, engaging, telling a good story. But if you're only focused on number 3, you sort of skip to number 2, I do worry that you sort of lose the audience ultimately and you lose the trust, because it looks like you're just more interested in what Ben describes as kind of running with the narrative rather than doing the slightly more sort of prosecutorial job of building the case. So I think what has happened over the last couple of days is there's a real lack of clarity now about what is Cummings actually accused of. You know, what is the fault? There is bad judgment at one end of the spectrum through to some sort of really out and out corruption, abuse of power at the other end. And as a result, he's kind of run rings around people. And as some people pointed out yesterday, so it slightly borders into submission as well, but in overwhelming detail.
I think so. I think, look, the reason why I think, Jonathan, thank you. I mean, I noticed that Louis Simpson makes a good point in the chat, which is lawyers act on behalf of clients and journalists obviously are not in that position. In fact, the job is to try and weigh the arguments and weigh the points and examine the facts, the truth. I'm going to bring in Hester McCreary in a moment, but Matt, Duncan, I just wanted to ask you what you think of it. Particularly will you deal with both, if you like, the sort of resistance journalism points, the risks of it, but there is also a kind of a version of journalism where we want our journalists to stand up for a person or a point of view that's not being heard. So how do you handle that? And then I'm going to come back to Dominic Cummings, and I'm going to come to you, Hester McCreary, in a moment. Matt, yeah?
Thanks, James. Well, I mean, it's great to see, Ben, and I really enjoyed the piece, which kind of confirmed to me not so much that Ronan Farrow is a resistance journalist, but he's a lazy journalist, and that something I'd suspected all along, which was that the real stars of the Me Too journalistic scoop were Megan Twohey and Jodie Cantor, and I think you showed that very strongly. I mean, on the broader question of resistance journalism, well, I mean, it should go without saying, and it was good to have it pointed out again, that journalism that doesn't have corroboration, factual rigor, really, impartial sourcing, isn't worthy of the name. Is there, though, a corollary risk that we, neglect that there is merit in narrative force? That cadence and rhythm and pace and humanization and personality in a story can really, be the vehicle for the factual points you're trying to make. I just worry that there's there are risks in this of a false dichotomy arising where, as it were, journalists are reduced to robotic data providers. And I'm not sure that's necessarily their civic or professional role.
Yeah, was that
Ben?
I totally agree with that. I think the trick about, I mean, I'm still learning to write this column in the New York Times, and I'm not, and I think the challenge with it is I'm not trying to enter some, sweeping dichotomous debate about journalism. I'm just trying to write about something that's happening, particularly in this country, although I think very much in the UK too right now, which is that certain kinds of stories get, I think lazily is a good word, a good adverb, swept into these narratives. Right, narrative journalism can be incredibly rigorous and accurate. I mean, it is worth adding that the kind of great tradition of narrative magazine journalism is in fact to make things up and to not be that rigorous and accurate. I mean, it can be done, and some of them, the best of it is that way. But actually, some of the best of it, if you look at the great kind of new journalism, is full of fabrications. And I think people forget. I mean, the history of the New Yorker is one of periodic scandals over made up sources and stories and things like that. It's been a long time, but in the sort of glory days of the New Yorker, one of its great writers was caught fabricating sources and said, oh, well, that's just sort of how it works in this kind of journalism. So I do think maybe it's a particular temptation of narrative journalism, but obviously, no, it's a great way. I mean, I'm not trying to make some kind of sweeping judgment about journalism in general. I'm more trying just to say that this is a thing that's happening right now in a pretty obvious way that I think everybody basically knows, and because they kind of like the stories, don't bother pointing to.
Isn't there, but Ben, can I just say one thing? Isn't there, because over the last year or two, I've had conversations with editors, at your paper, at the Washington Post, and there's this rather charming but not entirely credible case that's made, which is that the opinion functions and the reporting functions of US newspapers are separate, and actually what's happening in the news pages is just a rigorous attempt to try to get to the facts. And then of course your Maureen Dowds and your Tom Friedmans and your other columnists can let loose with their opinions, but there's no agenda in the newsroom, and I just find that incredible. And I wonder what you think is the truth of it.
Oh yeah, no, this is a column I actually woke up this morning as my opinion and news colleagues fight with each other on Twitter, and I've been sort of egging them on, thinking about this. I think that, when these papers were in print, there was sort of a logic, at least to readers, that you had something more resembling, although as you say, never free of opinion, but something more factual in certain parts of it, and then a part of the paper where you could read people's voices and opinions, and they were very clearly distinct. I think in this digital environment, just nobody knows the difference, including anybody who works there. I mean, which am I? Like, I'm a analysis columnist, I believe, in the news pages but my colleague Charlie Warzel, who often writes about similar things and used to work at BuzzFeed with me and is a great reporter and does a lot of reporting, is a sort of reporting columnist in the opinion pages. And you have to have a very acute sense of which is which to tell what we do apart.
And by the way,
I actually think it's very hard to sustain that distinction now. I think there's an argument for folding them together and just sort of saying, these are publications that represent a certain kind of broad cultural point of view that's open to, that is primarily focused on figuring out facts, but that obviously has a point of view. And I think the idea that you have slightly different branding on different pages and imagine that anybody knows the difference is a fantasy. I think The Guardian tries hardest. The opinion stuff is bright orange, and I think that's like as good a design solution as anybody has figured out on the internet for this. But I just don't think any reader really knows the difference.
I'm going to bring a couple of others if I might, Ben, and just wave at me when you've got to get going, because I know you've got to get to work at some point. Hester McCreary, are you there? And if I can, we're in the happy position, Ben, that we've got my former colleague at the BBC, Helen Bowden, who was my predecessor running news, and we've got David Yelland, who was the editor of The Sun. So we've got, a fair variety of people who've had some thoughts on this subject. But Hester, why don't I come to you first, and then I'll, if I may, go to David in a moment. Hi there.
Hi. Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Hear you well.
Great. Yeah. So I just wanted to weigh in basically on the Cummings story and say what a sad state of affairs it is when that's like the highlight of the day or even the week, and the most watched thing is that interview. How very, very sad and meaningless and unimportant I think basically it was. I don't think journalists were asking at all the right questions. I think there's been a lot of ambiguity over lockdown rules itself anyhow, and a much larger story would probably be what's going on actually on the streets, what people are doing day to day, as opposed to just having a and I mean, I'm not arguing in favour of Cummings here, but I just think it's a complete mess when this is apparently what we're interested in, the way journalists would have a go at him. So,
well, you just think it's one of those classic things where we've got ourselves into the Westminster bubble and we can't sort of see beyond that.
Like a Westminster witch hunt, yeah. I mean, I live between Camden Town and Holloway Road, and almost every day, if you go out on essential trips, it's a heavily dense populated area. There are everyday episodes of people of unrealistic social distancing expectations. Shops, international food markets opened with a queue outside and yet fresh produce on the front, so people will just, before they queue, start picking their produce, and then once you get in, there's no 2 meters between any shelves at all. So the whole sort of lockdown, social distancing, all of that guidance sort of falls apart day to day. I walked past a pub in Camden who have started doing takeaway beer, and people on the streets were really excited to have beer served to them, have pints through a window, who weren't leaving. So London pubs, that Camden corner sort of resembled a London pub on a hot summer
day. I know.
Everyone on the pavement. And I'm like, okay, so this is what's going on day to day. It appears that people are, it's really hard to social distance. Is a takeaway pint essential? Businesses appear to be taking it into their own hands. And then I turn on the news and I'm like, oh, apparently no, we're just having a witch hunt over.
No, someone said, I think you're right, Hester. Someone messaged me to say, from where I'm standing, you know, the lockdown is over, the people just haven't yet told the government. So I see your point. Yasmin, I see though that you are not a buyer. Yasmin, if we can bring you in, you're not a buyer of the argument this is just a political story, that there is an argument for what journalists are doing. Yeah, what's your view?
So I think a couple of different things. I think this has more cut through than it just being a Westminster bubble conversation. And certainly I've had numerous conversations with folks from sort of outside the political sphere who have sort of said, and before the press conference, actually, folks were like, well, you know, my uncle was like, this is great, he's going to resign, you know, this is why we moved to this country, this is a democracy that wouldn't exist, you know, back in, you know, Ethiopia or Sudan or whatever, right? So I thought that was really interesting because there was a sense of, okay, because this is a democracy, people might actually pay the consequences for their actions. Plot twist, that isn't how it always works. But what I do think, I have heard the phrase witch hunt used quite a lot, and I don't really think this is that. And the other thing that I wanted to mention that I put in the chat was, what really struck me yesterday was the homogeneity of the folks asking the questions, the level of groupthink almost. And yes, I understand that people have to create packages and so on, but again, outside the sort of political sphere, the concerns that I've heard voiced is, well, yes, this Cummings thing is a big deal and it feels like there's cut through because, you know, this person in power has done something that a lot of us have sacrificed for, but there are a whole bunch of other issues that haven't had the same sort of fury. And partly I think that's a reflection of the fact that the folks asking the questions haven't had to do the same. This is one of the first times they're like, oh, I sacrificed and my family sacrificed and this guy didn't. Whereas, you know, NHS folks, especially those from migrant backgrounds, have been dying. It took them ages to get tests, and there's like a lot of anger around that. And if you go slightly further back, things around Grenfell haven't been sorted and the questions were not nearly as furious. And so I do think that like this is quite a reflection of the state of play, and I'm sort of oscillating between fury and complete apathy because this isn't new.
So Yasmin, thank you. I can see, as you're talking, I can see Helen Bowden nodding. Helen and I worked together at the BBC, and she did my job running news for a good long while, longer than me, before me. And I think we're both nodding because I think we would have sat through that press conference thinking, please ask just one question. Please ask a short one.
Oh.
Helen, I'm going to turn to you and then go back to Ben before he runs off.
Okay, two short points. Firstly, most people here, I suspect, are phoning in from London. I'm phoning from Scarborough in North Yorkshire, where North Yorkshire and the North East have an R rate of 8. People in this town are still observing pretty good social distancing, and they're quite frightened. So the description of what's happening in London is not applicable to the rest of the country. Secondly, people outside of London were absolutely bloody furious about what Dominic Cummings did. Our Tory MP in Scarborough, my husband wrote to him yesterday, a very measured email. He replied within 5 minutes saying Cummings must go, because so many of his constituents had got in touch with him. This is not, at that point at least, a Westminster story. It's a story about privilege and hypocrisy, which none of them managed to nail yesterday, sadly. But my main point...
And Helen, forgive me, Helen, who's the MP for Scarborough?
Goodwill.
Oh, right, okay.
Robert Goodwill.
Okay.
And there was a whole load of Scarborough Yorkshire MPs, Tory MPs. We understand issued something like the same kind of email, and it's because they had so much pressure from their constituents. But my bigger point really was about the nature of the journalism, when you're going back to our original thing about resistance journalism, which makes my toes curl, and I don't think it's romantic at all. I think it's self-indulgent. I was taught, being raised as a reporter on File on 4, the first thing you do is you do your story, and it was an investigative programme, was find the evidence that would collapse your story, because that is the way you understand the weaknesses in the evidence that you're developing, and that is still an incredibly good rule.
But Helen, thank you. Can I just ask you one final thing though? The risk of the sort of the Puritan view of journalism, which is you report out the story, you don't run with an agenda, you don't have a position, you're not taking on the establishment or those in power, you're just trying to identify what is and what isn't true, is that you fall into the criticism that you and I dealt with for a long time, that it's not that your journalism is irresponsible, that it's bland, and it weighs both arguments and it misses the point.
Yeah, and that depends very much on the skill of the reporter in terms of finding ways of, as Matt talks about, be it written or in terms of your commentators or your witnesses, how you give them real life and vitality. It's not about jacking up and over-emoting on the facts, so-called.
Ben, before you go, what's your view of these new, if you like, offshoots of journalism, solutions journalism, constructive journalism, advocacy journalism, activist journalism, that are all, if you like, the cousins of the resistance journalism you talked about?
Yeah, I'm not sure they're offshoots. I mean, I think we may be the offshoot, right? I guess I just think that that this stuff can be done well or badly, and that most good reporting has elements of a lot of those things, and the notion, but that I do think there's a moment when there's a sense that the bad guys are so bad, and the sort of cheering section in social media is so loud that you can be lazy about your facts. And I think that, I guess in a way, part of my criticism is that when you build, you sort of construct your arguments on shaky foundations, they can collapse.
Right. And the cheering is interesting, is the risk of succumbing to the applause.
Yeah, risk, I mean reward mostly.
So Ben, listen, I know that you have to go and we're running for 15 minutes longer, so I just wanted to say thank you. It's really good to talk about it, both in the specifics and the bigger ideas. I hope you'll come and join another one of our thinkings another time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was cool.
Great, cheers, thanks so much. Mehdi Askaria, you've had your hand up, and Mehdi, I just wanted to hear what you think. Is that you in that? There you are.
Thank you, James. I must say I'm feeling really uncomfortable today. The reason is I'm getting a feeling that somewhat we are putting the journalism in the dock. I think what the Guardian and the Mirror did in unearthing the story, it actually is being a service to the country. And trying, I mean, today in the midst of what we are encountering, trying to actually question some of the perhaps motives or the tactics, is a bit disconcerting. What we are missing, perhaps, or we have actually missed during this conversation, is we are confronted with the situation that a person who is not an elected person, is an official who's actually governing us, is a person who has actually sacked the previous Chancellor of Exchequer, Javid Said Javid, and he respects or does not accept any accountability, and he shows total arrogance. And we are in the midst of saying now whether the journalists have asked the right question or the wrong question. I think somewhat I'm getting a bit I must say concerned about the direction that the conversation, the discussion has gone today on this forum.
Fair enough. I think that people do feel really strongly. The question, I think, Mehdi, and the reason why I think it's worth asking, is whether or not it's the job of journalists, when they get into that press conference, to convey that emotion, right? To be the people that say, look, we want to put to you, a person in power, the depth and strength of feeling, or actually to investigate the details of exactly what happened, and whether the one gets in the way of the other, or whether you have to do both. I think that's part of the question here. I'm going to come, if I can, but thank you. I really appreciate it. I'm going to come, if I might. David Yelland, I'm trying to rope you in. I don't know whether you're there still. I'd love to hear what you think. David, what do you think? Because of course, lots of people have views about the Sun. The point about its great claim to its place in the public square was about campaigning journalism, right? And of course, the risks of campaigning journalism are the ones that Ben was talking about. You've been out of the newspaper business for a while now. What do you think with the time to reflect?
Well, thanks for asking me, James. It's been completely fascinating. Somebody that grew up in Bridlington, I'm delighted to see Helen's coming from Scarborough, by the way. And it doesn't surprise me to hear what she said about what people around the country think about Dominic Cummings. And I've found some of what's been said during this session quite slightly alarming, in the sense that journalism has always been an inexact science, and it's always been a game that's played on various playing fields by various people for various ends. And what has actually happened in the last 10 years is that the bad guys have taken over the governments of the US and the UK. And I passionately believe that to be the case. So the thing that's changed is not journalism. Journalism has merely responded to what has happened, which is that people who tell untruths are in power. When I was editing in the New York Post and the Sun, you know, it was the time of governors Cuomo and Pataki, Giuliani, who was a great mayor, and then back here it was Tony Blair and then Gordon Brown. They didn't tell untruths. I mean, we can argue about Iraq and so on, but generally, that was a very different time. So I think journalism is adapting. What do you do if you were sat in a rose garden yesterday, listening to a man telling a series of lies, which is what happened, and you work for the BBC, where you have certain codes and so on? What, you know,
hold on, David. What do you say? What were the lies?
Well, I don't believe that he drove to Barnard Castle to test his eyesight, let's put it that way.
Right.
And a number of other things. It has become acceptable, stroke possible, for governments and, you know, for the president to he tells lies every day. We all know that. So I think, if I may say so, for the profession of journalism to start looking at itself as if it is the problem. And believe you me, I think there are lots of problems in journalism, but it isn't the problem. The problem is a bigger problem. And the last thing I'd say is, you know, I just want to point out an obvious thing, but what's something that people don't seem to think about very much, is the problem is caused so often by former journalists Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, Mary Wakefield, Dominic Cummings isn't a journalist, but he's a blogger. Steve Bannon, need I go on? Roger Ailes, I know Roger not with us anymore, but so I don't know what the answers are, but it's a profession that sort of didn't so much turn on itself, it turned on the world.
Mm.
Anyway.
There was an interesting piece, my colleague Matt Dancona, who spoke earlier, wrote a brilliant book, I should just say, on post-truth.
Absolutely.
And one piece that we commissioned was actually by a colleague of ours, Catherine Nixie, and she wrote about post-shame, right? And the difficulty that you're talking about, David, is what happens when the rules change, even when you expose something that is incorrect or untrue, doesn't necessarily result in what you thought it would result. It's taken on. I'd like to, if I can, just bring in my colleague Kerry Thomas, who's on the line. Kerry edited the Today programme for a fair old while, and we were talking earlier on this morning, trying to chew our pencil about this Dominic Cummings question. Are you there, Kerry? Have we lost him? Oh, there he is. Hello there.
No, I was sitting quietly, enjoying myself.
What do you make of this?
I mean, I think, I don't want to turn this into a sort of complete BBC reunion, but I thought to go back to something that Helen said and to pick up on something David has said, how do journalists respond in these times? My sort of closest brush with all this at the BBC was when we did a story about historic sex abuse, the sort of Operation Midland case. And I think what we saw in that case was the police came to believe that the old methods didn't work. And so you saw this radical shift by the police, and they said, we now, we have to say that what this, the man who came forward to make the allegations has said is credible and true. And so they entirely shifted the basis of policing away from evidence. And I think journalists who had reason to be concerned about the way that journalism had dealt with Jimmy Savile and case of sex abuse made a similar leap. They said the old ways don't work. We're not going to rely on two sources anymore. We're going to cut those corners because we believe it's a means to a necessary end. And I think the effect of that was that some very bad journalism was done and some very bad policing was done around that case. So I think, in a sense, I think that's what we're seeing. That's what Ben Smith picked out in the Ronan Farrow case, was that because there's not much room for argument about whether Harvey Weinstein was a monster or not, the corners that you cut in order to get to that conclusion don't really matter. But the truth is they do.
And Kerry, let's just do two things if we can. One is, can we just talk about the blog and the argument that Dominic Cummings has made about his role in the pandemic point more broadly?
So this story, many of you will have seen this story is moving this morning. So one of the first things that Dominic Cummings said in the Rose Garden was that the idea that he'd been opposed to lockdown was false because he'd been an early sort of super forecaster about the problems of pandemics. And he'd said this in a blog going way back. And it turns out, and Downing Street has now admitted, actually just in the last hour or so, that was not true, that the blog that Dominic Cummings was pointing to had been amended last month. He hadn't written it years ago. He inserted a new passage into that last month. I think this could turn out to be quite important because this was a highly, highly public event. He didn't need to do this. He pointed the finger at this blog himself in order to evidence a part of his case in his defense. And to go and lie and to have prepared that lie in the way that he did some time ago seems to me something that actually will keep this story going and does, I think, put him in further danger.
And then can I just ask you one other thing, which is I want to try and make the case, because I think it's quite easy to be wise after the event, and I think there'd be some people who would look at us, or me in particular, with a hollow laugh as we talk about this, because part of the issue with journalism is feeling as though it needs to take on the world as we find it. It needs to, if you like, have its causes. If it shies away from having an agenda, it gets sucked in by the establishment. And part of the reason that we set up Tortoise was to say, look, we do care about what happens next. And so we do give, if you like, more of a pass to the idea of solutions journalism. We do think that, you know, as we did a few weeks ago, taking on unheard voices is part of the work. And it's easy, Kerry, I think, to sort of be critical of things where there are errors in journalism. But the reality is that is the choice of an agenda. That is a choice of a set of priorities. And you can't shy away from that. And I think that all newsrooms either overtly or unwittingly do that.
It's easy to oversimplify. Now, I think any editor knows that what you decide to leave out of a story is as important as what you decide to put in, and that's not something that's ever, you know, very openly talked about. But I think the thing you can't move away from is just fact and evidence. And in fact, you know, you started this conversation with Ben by acknowledging the role that the New York Times, you know, whose journalism hasn't been faulted around Harvey Weinstein, played, having gone about it in a different way than Ronan Farrow did on the New Yorker. And so, you know, my argument, I suppose, is the old methods can still work. They're harder. They don't allow you to get there as quickly as the sort of new journalism, that the kind of resistance journalism that Ben was talking about. But, you know, there's real trouble if we give up on them.
Okay, well, we have magnificently fallen into a trap of our own making, which is to set ourselves, as in almost every news meeting, a long editorial agenda and then get to two items on it. One was resistance journalism, the second was Dominic Cummings, and so we've left things like restoration of the arts and culture on the table. We've left the chance to look further. I'm particularly interested in what's happening in India and the undercovering of what's happening in India. But I suppose the way to sum up this meeting is in the words of that great journalist quoted here, or at least I think partly quoted here, which is the mighty Claude Coburn, who is sort of partially quoted here by Andrew Brown, saying, journalism is partly entertainment, partly advertising. All you need to do is decide who you want to entertain and which cause you want to advertise. And I thank Andrew Brown for that. Stephanie Flanders joins us on Thursday evening, a descendant of that great Coburn journalistic dynasty, and we'll be talking about political writing because she and the other judges of the Orwell Prize will be here to talk about the best in political writing, and we can, I hope, examine and think a little more about the idea of resistance journalism, particularly in a time, as David Yelland was saying, when the rules of what counts as truth and shame in politics has fundamentally changed. Let me just wrap up by saying I do think that I take Mehdi's point, which is there's a risk that you end up having an argument about the wrong players on this particular ball. You're talking about the media when you should be talking about the politicians and the politics. I think, Mehdi, just to explain and to underline the reason why I think it's so important, is that when the rules change, and it's not just now, they changed obviously in the era of Tony Blair, they changed in the era of Margaret Thatcher, they changed in the era of Harold Wilson in the UK, and they've evidently changed in the US around the presidency of Donald Trump. The fact is that journalism does recalibrate, and it reaches, and at times I think it overreaches. And part of what we're trying to do is work out how best to do that. Kerry and I had a conversation a few weeks ago about the nature of tortoise journalism and the extent to which we lean in and pursue certain subjects. And he said something that was really striking to me, which was that anger is not a position, it's a conclusion. It should come from the nature of your reporting, and how we deliver that is something that we're thinking about a good deal. And so I was keen to bring Ben in to help us think through that, so we didn't make an easy reach to opposition journalism or resistance journalism. But we did understand the point. I noticed that Ian Campbell said right at the top that James O'Brien is one of his favourite journalists at work today. We did understand that point, that journalism can take a position and can take a stand. Of course, it's got to be rooted in that reporting. So forgive us for not having got to all of the issues on our open news list this week. But please do weigh in. Please just email me, james.harding@tortoisemedia.com. The other great failing, of course, is that we didn't get a chance to kick the tires on Chris Cook's reporting on universities. I can see him there breathing a sigh of relief. But actually, this is one of those stories that really, really matters to us. We think that there is something very profound at play, not just for students, not just for institutions, not just for research capabilities, not just for town centres and cities in the UK, but for all of those things. And so please, likewise, if you want to follow up on Chris's reporting, get in touch with him directly or me. We have a think-in actually this evening on the great distributors of loans and finance in this crisis, the role of banks. It's at 6:30 this evening. If you've got the time, do join us. But for now, a big thank you to everyone. Have a very good day.